We're going to move beyond the psychodynamic perspective of personality and talk about some other ones today. I wanted to start off with humanistic perspectives. Now, humanistic psychology, if you think back to when we sort of discussed it a little bit at the beginning of the semester, has primarily to do with the idea that it was a reaction against psychodynamics and behaviorism to a certain extent that treated humans sort of as lab rats for the researcher, for the psychologist, and said, no, these are people that we're helping. They are worthy of respect and attention and care, and we should discuss things that way. And another one of the basic differences of humanistic psychology, is the basic view of humanity, right? We talked about the idea that psychodynamics sort of viewed people as inherently bad or having inherently bad impulses that needed to be controlled. Humanistic psychology says, no, people are basically good. It's when we get messed up in our interactions that we start to have bad behavior, and there are ways to fix that. So, in regards to personality as such, we don't have within humanism or humanistic psychology a coherent theory of personality, but rather some implications for personality. So I explained to you a couple of chapters ago, I can't remember in which one, maybe the last chapter, we talked about humanistic psychology and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In much the same way that we were, what were we talking about? I think it was development, right? In the much the same way that his hierarchy of needs is not necessarily a theory of development, it is not necessarily a theory of personality, but has something to say about personality. If you look at the idea that humans have to attend to their most basic needs before they can worry about higher order needs, how somebody behaves characteristically is going to depend on what needs are being met and which ones aren't. So I'm going to behave very differently if I'm worried about where my next meal is coming from, as opposed to how I will behave if I've got most of these things under control, but I'm worried about self-actualization, right? So that speaks to personality a little bit, even though it isn't necessarily a personality theory per se. Another person that had something to say about it was Carl Rogers, also working within the realm of humanistic psychology. He, much like Maslow, was interested in humans' drive towards self-actualization, towards being the best that they can be, and he felt like, and this is honestly a pretty compelling point of view to me, at least. I suppose you can decide whether you think so or not. He felt like humans are born with the blueprint inside themselves for being the best them that they could possibly be. Each of us are born with our own idea of how to be our best self, and we don't need to be trained how to do it. It's just going to happen just because of who we are. That's how Rogers looked at things. He felt then that people get away from or move astray from their self-actualization as they come into contact primarily with the people who teach them, their parents and their early leaders in their life. Because we need not only to be our best self, but we also need to be accepted by the people around us. And so these two things can come into conflict, especially as a child, when you are, you don't know the rules for how the world is supposed to work, and you're just trying to do what you want to do and be your best self, and that comes into conflict with how your parents want you to behave, and they start to tell you, don't be like that, don't do this, don't do that. Here's the right way to be. And so we then start to internalize their ideas for how we are supposed to be instead of following our own blueprint. This in and of itself is not necessarily a problem. It's how this gets communicated that causes problems, according to Rogers. because many of us experience in our growing up years what he called conditional positive regard. This is the idea that we are only worthwhile human beings if we behave in the way that we are expected to behave. And when we don't, then love, respect, acceptance is withdrawn, right? And as we then have our need for positive regard or our need for acceptance from others withdrawn from us, then that pushes us away from our own blueprint for how we should behave and who we should be, and towards the blueprint of whoever it is that is withdrawing their regard from us. And that then leads to discrepancies between how we behave and who we feel we ought to be, sort of in our deepest self. And we actually can come up with separate conceptions of the self. There's the actual self, the us as we really are, as we perceive ourselves to be in the moment. There is our ideal self, the person we think we ought to be. There is our feared self, the person we are worried that we are going to become. And when we find distance between our ideal self and our actual self, we suffer self-discrepancies, which causes anxiety, according to Rogers, and causes us to behave in irrational and unhelpful ways. And he felt like this was where all bad behavior came from. It was from these self-discrepancies. The way to fix this, according to Rogers, was through therapy, unsurprisingly, but a particular type of therapy where the therapist is supposed to demonstrate unconditional positive regard for the individual, treat them as worthy of respect, love, and attention, regardless of what they've done. And he felt that if you treat someone as if they are worthy of your regard, no matter how they behave, then a lot of those problem behaviors just sort of fall by the wayside and go away, and they become their ideal self. They're closer to their blueprint self, right? And the problems just fall away. Now, this type of therapy does have a pretty decent track record of success, comparable with other more modern therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy and things like that, in some cases at least. And this is pretty compelling to me. And I bring it up now in terms of personality because, once again, we're talking about characteristic ways of behaving. Do you behave in the characteristic ways that you do? Excuse me. Do you behave the way that you do because that's your blueprint and that's what you're following? Or is it because you've internalized the oughts and should nots of your parents and your religious leaders and whoever else, and that then is causing you high levels of anxiety? It's worth thinking about, right? I find this to be a pretty compelling viewpoint. All right, other things that can shape personality from sort of a social psychology point of view is the shape of your culture. We have a variety of cultures across the globe, of course. It's not the same everywhere you go. And one of the basic differences that get studied between cultures is how collectivistic versus how individualistic that culture is. Now, this it's on a spectrum, right, where you have extreme collectivism on one end and extreme individualism on the other. And different countries fall in different places. Now, in order to define this a little bit better, a collectivistic culture is a culture in which the basic unit of society is the family, or the group, or the community, right? How the group gets defined may differ from place to place, but that is the basic unit of society. In individualistic societies, on the other hand, it is the individual that is the basic unit of society, the active portion of society. And you can see how that might lead to different kinds of behavior and different value systems based on what is which of these styles is preferred in the place that you live. Now, we in the United States live in a pretty highly individualistic culture where we value going your own way and doing things yourself and lifting yourself up by your bootstraps and all of that sort of capitalistic stuff, right? Now, individualism is not the same as capitalism, even though those two do tend to go together, at least some. Um, all right, so that's where we are. We're sort of more towards the individualistic side in our society. But if you go to other places in the world, especially a lot of different places in Southern Asia, China, Japan, Thailand, some of these other places, um, you tend to find cultures that are more collectivistic uh, in their approach, in their worldview. What this then leads to is behavior that is prized in one society might be viewed as problematic in another, right? If I'm saying, no, I'm not going to work with you guys, I've got my own idea, I'm going my own way, and I'm getting it done. Here in the United States, that's viewed as a sign of strength. We really value that sort of go-get-'em attitude. Um, in some of these other places, more collectivistic places, that's problem behavior. You're making things worse, not making things better. And so the value systems that are in place in those societies then shape people's behavior. You find more people that value principles and thus behave in ways, characteristically, personality, that correspond to the value systems of that place, right? You're going to find fewer people raising a stink about how the boss does things in a collectivistic culture than you will in an individualistic culture. Now, is one better than the other? I don't know. I think they both probably have their advantages in different situations. But it is another one of these sort of cultural level factors that can influence how personality turns out. Okay, let's move beyond some of these perspective-bound theories and talk about the trait theory of personality, which rather than coming from a psychological perspective, was based a little bit more in the math of psychology. How the trait theory of personality came about is as our statistics evolved and got more specific and more complicated over the last century or so, we were able to look at just gather a bunch of data from a bunch of individuals in terms of how they responded in different scenarios and see which of those characteristic ways of behaving hung together, meaning which of those responses correlated with other responses, and did those have something in common? And if they did, maybe that was a single trait or a cluster of traits that went together. And as we gathered more and more of this data, and eventually a lot of this data, you've got tens of thousands of people that have contributed data to these data sets, you start to see really clear patterns across individuals where certain personality traits tend to go together with other personality traits. The person who is quick to lose their temper is also probably is likely to be more outgoing, right? The person who is very anxious in social situations is also likely to have more negative mood, be a little bit more depressed, right? So these traits tend to hang together. They tend to go together. They form clusters. And this then turned into what we call the trait theory of personality, that there are certain traits that are associated with each other, and you can understand someone or have a greater likelihood of understanding someone if you know one of their traits, because you know what other traits are likely to go with that and which other traits they are likely to lack or be low on, right? So you can see some of the early work here. This type of statistical analysis is called a factor analysis. It's essentially really complicated correlations between items or between characteristics. If you want to get a little bit more specific there, you're going to need to take the statistics class in psychology, which is a fun one. I might be lying about that. At any rate, you can see some of the traits here that tend to go together. Folks who are high in warmth tend to be slightly above average on self-reliance and on boldness and on impulsivity and on privateness. You cluster those together, and that can be, you look at what do those all have in common? It's outgoingness, it's extroversion, right? Insecurity and irritability tend to be correlated with emotional stability, correlated negatively, that is, so that someone who is low in emotional stability is going to be higher in irritability and security. You cluster those together, you got anxiety, and you can sort of see some of these other clusters as they start to hang together. This was some pretty early work that then got revised. You've had a bunch of different researchers that have tried to figure out what the basic trait clusters are. So Allport and Cattell, Gordon Allport, if I remember correctly, was actually the graduate school advisor for my graduate school advisor. Not that anybody cares about that, but there you go. These two gentlemen came up with 16 different binaries, I guess you could say, or spectra, where you can go all the way to one end on this trait or all the way to the other, or you're going to be somewhere in between, right? So you can be very, very reserved. The less reserved you are, the more outgoing you are. So they're sort of opposite poles of the same trait. And what they found that was very interesting was that they tested a bunch of different individuals on all 16 of these trait pairs, and also collected data on their employment, like what's your job. And they found characteristic differences in some of these traits depending on what jobs people had, which once again sort of goes, it sort of stands to reason, right? If you are the kind of person who enjoys artistic pursuits, you're probably more likely to end up as a writer or as an actor than you are an airplane pilot, right? Which are the three that are listed here. And you can sort of see the writers and the creative artists, those two, the blue and the red lines, track together really closely, right? Because those are two very closely related pursuits. In fact, you could say that writers are creative artists. They are a subset of creative artists. In comparison, being an airline pilot is a very different job. Now, this was being an airline pilot back in like mid-60s, which is a very different story than it is now, but still different, right? So you can see that the airline pilots tended to be higher in emotional stability and higher in conscientiousness and way less sensitive, shocking, way more practical, way more self-assured, far more controlled, far more relaxed, right? As compared to, writers and creative artists, which we tend to think of as being a little bit more neurotic, a little bit more sensitive, a little bit more reactive. As someone who is a writer on the side and used to be an actor, yeah, that's more or less right. At any rate, this was sort of early work in the trait theory approach. Now, Hans Eysenck actually revisited this and said 16 is way too many. Let's pare that down to just two different binaries or two different factors that you can be high or low on. And so his original work just took it down to a stability factor and an introversion-extroversion factor. And so he put these then on a quadrant scale. Sure. And you can sort of identify yourself in terms of how extroverted you are versus how introverted. Are you high on that scale? Are you low on that scale? Are you high on the stability versus instability scale? So someone who is high in extroversion and also high in instability is touchy and aggressive and impulsive and active and maybe also optimistic, right? Because their mood is going to be more malleable. It's going to shift more, right? But they're also outgoing and active. And so you end up in that yellow quadrant there. Someone who is high in emotional instability And low in extroversion, meaning they're introverted, that's someone who's going to be moody and anxious and reserved and quiet. And then you move more towards the stability side on the lower end of this figure. And if you're introverted, then you're someone who is careful and thoughtful and passive, perhaps. Even-tempered, calm. Someone higher on the extroversion scale, but low in emotional instability is going to be sociable and outgoing and lively and a leader, right? And so you can sort of see how that goes. Now, in later years, Eysenck came back and added a third factor to this figure. So imagine you've got a third axis coming out of your screen. So it's like a 3D sphere instead of a circle. So his third factor was what he called neuroticism. And so that ended up being called the PEN, P-E-N model of personality, which was psychoticism, if I remember right, extroversion, and neuroticism. So psychoticism is sort of the angry, violent, surgency sort of behavior. Neuroticism is the anxiousness, moodiness, depression sort of stuff. So you can be high or low in either one of those, and also high or low in extroversion. And so he sort of reshaped this into, he took that emotional instability and separated it out into psychoticism and neuroticism. So that is still pretty widely used today, the PEN model. Now, the most commonly used model for personality within the trait theory is what we call the Big Five model of personality, where you have 5 major factors. These 5 factors can form the acronym OCEAN, O-C-E-A-N, or canoe if you prefer. Either one works. You've got openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And much like the others, this is a scale, right, where you can vary from low to high. And you could probably look at this and identify without too much difficulty where you are on all 5 of these. If I were talking about myself, I'm probably like a 5 on openness and like a 2 or 3 on conscientiousness, if I'm being honest. 3 or 4 on extroversion, 6 on agreeableness, and like a 2 on neuroticism, right? And you can sort of see the characteristics that go along with all of these 5, right? Someone who is high in agreeableness is going to be trusting. I'm sorry, what was that word? Trusting, lenient, soft-hearted, good-natured. Someone who is low in agreeableness is going to be suspicious and critical and ruthless and irritable. So generally speaking, you find where people are on each one of these 5 factors by asking them a bunch of questions or giving them a bunch of statements that have to do with scenarios that they can say are very much like themselves or not at all like themselves. And usually they're Likert type questions. Everybody always says Likert questions for these 1 to 7 things or 1 to 5 things. It's actually Likert, even though I really want it to be Likert because that's how I learned it and that sounds better. The actual researcher's name is Likert, so it's a Likert scale. I'm sorry. Anyways, you get a bunch of these different scenarios that someone has to either say, this is very much like me, this is not at all like me, very much agree, strongly disagree, however that's phrased. What you get are questions like, I'm super comfortable when I'm out at a party. That would be a 1 for me. Thank you very much. You can miss me with that party. But that's me, right? That's how I would respond to that question. And there would be many of these prompts, whether you're talking about many being 40 or 50 or many being 500, which some of them are. The more of these scenarios you respond to, the more specific data you can gather, because all of these questions are going to correspond to one of the factors, right? So the one that I just mentioned about going to the party would probably be an extroversion question, right? How much do you enjoy being around other people? Lots of other people, right? Not at all. Okay, so at any rate, you can take these personality quizzes. I guess you should let's call them measures. When you talk about personality quizzes, I start to think about like Facebook quizzes, and I talked about those last time, right? They're all junk. They are only there so that you will click on them and give them your Facebook data. Hardly any of them are scientifically validated at all. And so don't trust those. There are other personality scales. I usually get students asking about the Myers-Briggs personality inventory, and that's pretty well validated as well. The Big Five tends to be the one that gets used most in psychological research, so that's the one that we talk about the most. All right, now, if you really, because the trait theory of personality is sort of unmoored or not bound up in any psychological perspective, you have to sort of think it through a little bit in order to figure out what the implications of this are. Where is personality coming from, if not from how you were treated as a child, or what's living in your unconscious, or any of these other conceptions that we've talked about so far? Well, trait theory says that our behavior comes from both our genetic inheritance, and there's a lot of research to back this up within the trait theory model and data sets, that a lot of these personality factors tend to cluster in families, right? Now, when you're talking clusters and families, that still doesn't necessarily tease apart the genetic contribution from the situational factors, right? Because you probably grew up with your family. But not everybody did, and there's been some fascinating research that's been done, especially twin studies, right? So there's a certain number of twins living out there in the world, and from those sets of twins, some small subset will have been given up for adoption at birth, right? And some subset of those given up for adoption at birth will have been adopted separately. Researchers have gone to great lengths to recruit those people and test them on a wide variety of personality factors. And you can compare across these data sets. There's the biggest one, I think, is the Michigan, or is it Minnesota? No, I think it's Michigan. Twin study, where you've got hundreds and thousands of twin pairs who have answered personality questions, and you can compare how similar these two groups are based on whether they were raised together or raised separately. And it depends on the personality factor. Some personality factors are mostly situational in nature, right? So it depends on how you're raised. But then there are other things, more basic personality factors, where you still see high levels of concordance between twins who were raised separately, meaning that it's likely, if you're talking about a large group of these twins, it's likely that those factors are more strongly influenced by genetic inheritance, right? Because even though those two people didn't grow up together, did not have the same background, still they ended up being very similar to each other on those things. Now, which personality factors are more strongly genetic and which are more strongly environmental? I don't know. I'm not a personality psychologist. I don't really study this stuff. But the data is out there. If this is something that's interesting to you, there's a lot of stuff that you could really dig into. Okay, now I sort of implied this, but one of the things that we've got to do with personality is test it, right? Because otherwise, how are we going to know how personality works or what your personality is? I mean, we do have sort of the everyday kind of categorizations of personality that we use with our friends and family and whatnot, but that's not what we want to be using in research. We want to be able to test these things and reproduce our findings over and over again. So how do you test personality? Well, I mentioned already the primary way of testing personality from the trait theory perspective, which is using assessment tools where you're asking people lots and lots of different questions about scenarios or how they or what they prefer, and each of those questions corresponds to some factor or another. Here you can see some data pulled from the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI, which is one of the most commonly used personality tools. This is one that has been given to enough different people that you can actually use it as a preliminary diagnostic tool. So you can see different characteristic responses depending on whether someone is suffering from depression or schizophrenia or or are they just in the normal range, right? Because we've given these to enough people that we've sort of identified where the range that most people fall into for all of these factors, and then what is outside that range. And if that's outside that range, is that something that needs to be paid more attention to? Is this somebody who needs to be referred for clinical services, et cetera, right? Now, that's not the only way to test for personality, even though it is the primary way that we use within psychological research and psychological care treatment. There are other, if you go back to some of these other psychological perspectives that we talked about earlier, especially the psychodynamic perspective, if personality arises from the unconscious, then you've got to test what's in the unconscious in order to figure out what the person's personality is. So there's a couple of different ways to do this. There's different what we call projective tests, where the basic idea of projective testing is you give some ambiguous stimulus and allow the person to project themselves onto the stimulus. So the Rorschach ink blot test is a classic example of this. Here you have images that could come from a Rorschach ink blot test where literally it's just somebody dropping ink onto a page and folding it over and letting it dry. So they are literally abstract images. However, a psychodynamic therapist interested in discovering what's happening in a person's subconscious might give the inkblot test to someone, asking them with each of these images, one by one, tell me what you see here. Well, I look at these images and I see a cow skull in the first one, and a voodoo mask in the second one, and a butterfly in the third one. Right? Now, there would be more than three. You would have a lot of different ones, and you would be asked to not think about it too hard, just say whatever pops into your mind first, in order to allow your unconscious mind to sort of bubble up to the surface and spit out whatever is there, right? And that then a trained psychodynamic therapist is going to be able to interpret those responses to find the commonalities amongst a person's responses to figure out what the person is really concerned about way down deep. So, if somebody comes to these and says, I see death and murder and killing, well, maybe that's time to call the police. I don't know. But it's not going to be that obvious, of course, but you can see commonalities, and a trained therapist then would be able to identify what's going on in the person's subconscious. Another projective test is the thematic apperception test. This, rather than giving ink blots to the person, you have images, whether they're paintings or photographs. I've seen both styles be done. One of the images that I know belongs to the thematic apperception test is an image of it's a photograph of a woman, white woman in her mid-30s maybe, standing outside a bedroom door that's open. She has her back against the wall outside the room, and she has her arms folded and her head sort of down. She's looking more towards the floor, and she looks anywhere from neutral to unhappy, depending on how you choose to look at it. You can see through the doorway that she's next to, and it's a bedroom, and there is a man sitting on the bed. The bed is made. He's sitting with his elbows on his knees, sort of leaning forward, again looking at the ground, his hands sort of clasped in front of him. And that's the image, right? Now, as a psychodynamic therapist, you might show this image to somebody and say, tell me this story. What's going on here? Now, there's 100 different stories you could tell there. The man's praying and his wife is eavesdropping. Weird, but okay. They just had a huge fight about finances, and they got super mad at each other and now aren't speaking. Their daughter just died and they're upset, but they can't talk to each other about it, right? And so you could come up with a thousand different things, right? And once again, you show many of these images to the individual that you're testing, and for the trained therapist, then you pay attention to the commonalities to see what's coming out of the person. What are they? What stories are they telling? What commonalities show up in what they say? Well, that's probably something that the person is unconsciously worried about, focused on, sort of characteristically pinpointing, right? And so that is a way to sort of talk about and think about personality. Now, projective tests tend to be, by their nature, less well validated than trait theory measures of personality, because they are less subject to turning into numbers and crunching them. Right? Now, we as psychologists love our numbers and love to crunch them, and so we tend to prefer most of us tend to prefer the trait theory tests, the MMPIs and the Big Five inventories, as opposed to the projective tests, because they're so open to interpretation. A person could say the exact same things to two different psychodynamic therapists and end up with two different assessments of their personality, because it's the therapist that has to interpret it, right? And so there's an extra layer of abstraction, or maybe 2 or 3 layers of abstraction, between what's really going on characteristically with the person and what is being diagnosed. So we tend to focus more on the trait theory of personality in modern day psychology than we do projective tests or other types of tests, simply because they're less well scientifically validated. And while science may not be the only way to understand the world, it is a regimented and reliable way to understand the world, and so we tend to stick with that, right? All right, that's all I'm going to say about personality. That's it for this week. Thank you very much for paying attention and making it through all these videos, and we'll come back at you next week with something else. Have a good one.